The fall of 1973, heading into the winter of 1974, was an important time in the classic era of progressive rock music, with many notable albums from major bands being issued in this period. A new band would also emerge in this period that was, while a new band, one that had roots to the earliest days of progressive rock, received with some anticipation by the music press and by the public at large. The band only made one album, and unfortunately that album is more remembered today for some of the band and record company politics that emerged around it. And it's a shame, because it was a very, very good record. I'm talking about the album that was issued in February of 1974 by the band Refugee. The members of Refugee had an interesting history. The rhythm section of Refugee, bass guitarist and vocalist Lee Jackson, and drummer, the late Brian Davison, had been the rhythm section for The Nice, the band that brought Keith Emerson to prominence prior to his ultimately making the decision to disband that working unit in order so that he could launch Emerson, Lake and Palmer. Jackson's and Davison's partner in Refugee was the keyboard player Patrick Moraz, who at the time was a relative unknown, but who was well known in music circles. Moraz had first encountered Jackson and Davison while The Nice was touring Switzerland in 1969, and Moraz shared his contact information with both Jackson and Davison, as well as with Keith Emerson, in order to potentially pursue opportunities going forward. Following the breakup of The Nice, Jackson and Davison launched their own musical projects. They were each signed as solo artists by The Nice's label, Charisma Records, and would make albums under those agreements. Brian Davison would make one album with his band Every Which Way in 1970, and Lee Jackson would make 4 albums. He'd make an initial album with his band Jackson Heights in 1970 for Charisma, which did not gain too much traction, and ultimately that band fragmented and broke up. With the releases from Every Which Way and Jackson Heights not having done well, Charisma terminated those contracts with Jackson and Davison. Jackson, however, regrouped. He formed a new version with the vocalist John McBurney and the keyboard player Brian Chatton, and found a new record company contract in the UK with Vertigo Records. Interestingly, this version did not maintain a permanent drummer, but the band had enough friends in the business to where they were able to secure the services of several notable drummers, including ex-King Crimson drummers Michael Giles and Ian Wallace, and Deep Purple's Ian Pace, to work with them on a session basis on their various records. Jackson Heights, however, was not able to gain traction in the United States. Their second album was released in the United States on the MGM Verve label. Their first was released on Mercury under an arrangement that had been established by Charisma Records for the distribution of the Nice's albums. However, their third and fourth albums were not released in the United States, and although Vertigo made a significant amount of investment in Jackson Heights' fourth album, Bump and Grind, it was clear that that band was not moving forward in the way that the record company or that Lee Jackson wanted. In mid-1973, Jackson had the idea that it might work for Jackson Heights to partner with Patrick Moraz. By 1973, Moraz had developed a good name for himself in the music business. He had made one attempt at building his own progressive rock band in 1971, the Swiss band Main Horse, with his partner Jean Ristori. And following that, Moraz worked on various movie soundtracks as a source of income. He was well known, by virtue of his film work particularly, as a master of the keyboards and of the Moog synthesizer. And Jackson was of the opinion that adding Moraz as a contributor to Jackson Heights, either as a keyboard player or possibly as an orchestrator, could assist with that band's fortunes. Moraz heard Jackson's proposal regarding Jackson Heights and politely declined it, but suggested an alternative. He was interested in pursuing a keyboard-led trio along the lines of what Jackson and Davison had done with the Nice, and insisted to Jackson that Brian Davison be part of that. And with that, Refugee was born in the fall of 1973. They rehearsed relentlessly over the course of their first several months of existence, some say as many as 8 hours a day in intense rehearsals. And I'm sure, upon listening to some of Refugee's music, that those rehearsals were intense. Moraz was the primary composer for the band's material, with lyrics provided by Lee Jackson. And that music is demanding, certainly as demanding as what Emerson, Lake and Palmer were doing at the time. Refugee would play its first concerts in December 1973, and by early 1974 had a record company contract. They were able to sign with Jackson's and Davison's old employer, Tony Stratton Smith, at Charisma Records. And during February of 1974, recorded their one, and as it turned out, their only album, their self-titled Refugee. The Refugee album is, in my opinion at least, a really fine one, and one that is sadly somewhat forgotten, especially given some of the history that transpired around the band following its release. It is an album of borderline symphonic rock, with Moraz incorporating multiple types of keyboards, including piano, organ, mellotron, and various synthesizers. Most of the compositions on the album are fairly lengthy. The album in total runs over 50 minutes in length. Even the shortest selections on the album are in the neighborhood of about 5 minutes running time. And the two keystone pieces of the album are extended length suites. One, the Grand Canyon Suite, is nearly 17 minutes to end side one, and the other, Credo, runs over 18 minutes. This was not music for casual listening, and it was not music that was terribly well received by North American radio, except for play very late at night. But it was recognized as very strong music. It was released in the United States by Atlantic Records via their distribution deal with Charisma that had been established several months earlier, that had also brought Genesis to the Atlantic label. It appeared that Refugee were positioned for at least moderate success, if not stardom, based on the great results around their first album and the association with Atlantic, which was a solid distribution deal that Tony Stratton Smith had wanted for Charisma Records for quite some time. Unfortunately, things would change rather rapidly. By May of 1974, one of Atlantic Records' biggest acts in the progressive rock space, Yes, was experiencing a crisis when their keyboard player, Rick Wakeman, opted out of the band in order to pursue his solo career full-time. Yes needed to find a replacement rather quickly in order to maintain their success in the marketplace, and it looked, at least initially, like they would place a new keyboard player with them quickly, John Anderson's friend Vangelis. That, however, did not work out as was originally thought. Vangelis wanted to pursue a solo career at this point without very much input from other musicians. Apparently, the music journalist from the British newspaper Melody Maker, Chris Welch, mentioned Patrick Moraz to Yes's manager, Brian Lane, as someone who might be a possible fit. And evidently, Atlantic Records, despite having Moraz under contract, at least indirectly through Charisma, did not object to Yes's pursuing conversations with Moraz about potentially replacing Wakeman. Certainly Atlantic were very well vested in Yes's success at this point in time, whereas Refugee were, although an act with some very good pedigrees behind them, were still a relatively new band that hadn't proven themselves in the marketplace yet. Patrick Moraz auditioned with Yes in August of 1974 and was quickly brought on board. Refugee would soon afterwards play their last concerts in the UK in August of '74, with Lee Jackson announcing to those in attendance that Patrick Moraz would have a new job in the very near future. And within weeks, Moraz would be working with Yes on their first, and as it would turn out, their only studio album with Patrick Moraz, Relayer, released in November of that year. With that, the story of Refugee came to a close. Jackson and Davison did not look to restart the band with another keyboard player. In his autobiography, Keith Emerson makes the comment that he was personally rather irritated at the course of events that took place here. Emerson had always felt a bit guilty about leaving Jackson and Davison behind when he made the move to start Emerson, Lake and Palmer. Emerson recognized that there were some deficiencies in working with Jackson and Davison, most notably the range of Lee Jackson's singing voice, that couldn't be corrected were he to remain with them. But he had been firm friends with both Jackson and Davison and wanted the best of success for both of them. Emerson was very happy when Refugee launched, even more so that the band was launched under the auspices of Tony Stratton Smith and the Charisma label. And Emerson felt that, in some regards, Jackson and Davison were really cheated by having yet another keyboard player leave them a second time in the lurch and putting their careers at risk. Tony Stratton Smith was probably not very happy with Yes and with Atlantic Records with this turn of events either. It probably wasn't an accident that in the fall of 1974, Charisma Records' American distribution deal with Atlantic Records was terminated. Genesis would remain with Atlantic Records in North America, and indeed, their records are distributed by Atlantic to this day. But Stratton Smith would move the Charisma label, other than for the licensing of Genesis and Peter Gabriel's material, in order to establish distribution through the Mercury Phonogram label in the United States, in a deal that would persist until 1980. Refugee was a band that put out only one album, but it's a brilliant one. If you haven't heard it, I suggest that you give it a listen. It is wonderfully put together with some brilliant keyboard work and great interplay between the keyboards and the rhythm section. The relentless rehearsal that the band pursued in late 1973 absolutely paid off in the making of their album. Lee Jackson did not have the very best of singing voices, but on most of the songs on Refugee's album where vocals are employed, he does a creditable enough job to where at least I can see that if the band had stayed together a while longer and possibly crafted a couple of songs that were more radio friendly, that they might have had a chance in the marketplace. As it was, though, they've become sadly something of an interesting footnote more than anything else. They're the band that, yes, stole Patrick Moraz away from. And that's a shame. They deserved far better. Anyway, that is the story on Refugee. I'll be interested to hear your comments here as always. Please feel free to leave them with the video. Of course, please click like on the video if you enjoyed this performance. And of course, if you haven't subscribed to Propaganda yet, by all means, please do. We're here at least once, sometimes twice a week with new material to share with you, and plan on doing that for a good long time going forward. Thanks as always. You take care. Bye-bye.